date is July 1st, 1863. Robert E. Lee just had victory up at down in Chancellorsville, Virginia, and he has talked with President Jefferson Davis of the Confederate Army to go north and invade Pennsylvania. And his plan was to go to Harrisburg, but the Union Army had other plans to race on up through and follow Lee. So eventually they met at a junction called Gettysburg. And this is the first day of a 3-day battle that will be the bloodiest battle in the war. I have with me Jeff Sharaa's Civil War battlefields, and I have an excerpt here of the first day's battle. Meade, who is nearly 15 miles south of Gettysburg, had not expected his army to reach the town in time to prepare for a major engagement. Knowing that Lee was so close, Meade felt that the Federal troops should make a stand well south and good defensive position around a place called Pipe Creek. But Buford saw the opportunity that Gettysburg offered, a strong ridge of high ground that spread from north to south along the eastern edge of the town itself. Buford's challenge would be to hold off Heath's Confederates long enough for the Federal infantry to occupy the good ground. The Union First Corps under General Reynolds was only a short distance below the town when Buford's fight began. Buford's cavalry had an advantage of confronting the rebels with breech-loading carbines, and though greatly outnumbered by Heath's infantry, they held up the rebels just long enough for Reynolds' infantry to reinforce them. Lee had been quite adamant that he was not yet ready for a general engagement at Gettysburg, and had been reassured that Heath's foray into the town would brush aside whatever small force of cavalry they would find there. By late morning, Lee could hear much more than a skirmish coming from the town, and when reports reached Lee that Union infantry was reinforcing the Federal cavalry, Lee knew that, like it or not, a general engagement was just what he was getting. Lee ordered Ewell, who was approaching Gettysburg from the north, to hasten his march and confront the Union forces, troops who were already in a sharp fight around the northwest corner of the town. And as Reynolds moved his infantry into position, the fight grew hotter. Despite the extraordinary effort by both Buford and Reynolds, the fresh Union infantry was confronting an enemy on two sides, an enemy whose numbers continued to grow. With men falling around him, Reynolds continued to shift troops into position, attempting to stem them from the rebel tide. Reynolds knew that directly behind his First Corps, Oliver Howard's 11th Corps was fast approaching. Despite a dismal reputation the 11th had earned for the collapse at Chancellorsville, here the 11th might save the day. The Union right flank was feeling severe pressure from the north, and if the 11th could be put into position to the right of the First Corps' bloody fight, they might prevent Reynolds' men from being annihilated. As Reynolds rode along his lines, encouraging his men, he was suddenly struck in the back of the head by a musket ball and tumbled out of the saddle. On the eve of the greatest confrontation of the war, the Union Army's finest field commander had been killed. Now, from where I'm positioned, the bridge get over here, where I'm over by the Eternal Light, there's some trees over in that area, some woods, as you can see, directly to my right, to the camera's left. That's known as Reynolds Woods, and that's where he falls. Already within the first day of battle, a Union general was already killed. Now, I actually happen to know a relative of General Reynolds through my wife, who works with him at the school, and he talks extensively about General Reynolds when he can, and also when I can. But General Reynolds' death will not be in vain, as for the Union suffered a great defeat on the first day. They're pushed back into Gettysburg, and there's urban fighting throughout that. And I've also heard stories of where the railroad cut is, right where that bridge is. about U.S. soldiers coming in, and Confederates were dug in to help fight against the Union forces, and pretty much it was almost like shooting, fish in a barrel, because when the Union stormed up, they at one point they stormed up and they just shot them like fish in a barrel, and then eventually they were forced back and retreated. So if you know anything about Gettysburg, there is a local legend that happened during the first day's battle, and that legend is the legend of John Burns. Now, legend says John Burns was a War of 1812 battle veteran, as well as a Mexican-American War veteran. He fought both wars, and in his late 60s, late 70s even, he moved from New Jersey, fought at the Lundy's Lane, and then fought in the Mexican-American War, and then moved to Gettysburg after everything. And then when the fighting came, John decided to grab his old musket, come out to the first day's battle, and fire at some Confederates. And another part of the legend is that he was about to be overcome with Confederates, the enemy, and he threw aside his musket. Well, at least one of the legends is he threw aside his musket, and a Confederate walked up to him and said, "What are you doing out here, old man?" And he's like, "I've been looking for my cows. Cows got out." And funny enough, right here there's some cows. But that's one of the legends. Now, I recently read a book by Timothy Smith, who is the Adams County Historical Society's historian, and also an author who actually wrote about John Burns. And I have his book here that I want to take some excerpts from to fill you on more about the legend of John Brown and give you the factual details of what happened here at Gettysburg on the first day's battle. So, Sergeant George Eustace of Company F with the 7th Wisconsin wrote, "It must have been about noon when I saw a little old man coming up in the rear of Company F. In regard to the peculiarities of his dress, I remember he wore a swallow-tied coat with smooth brass buttons. He had a rifle on his shoulder. We boys began to poke fun at him as soon as he came amongst us, as we thought no civilian in his senses would show himself in such a place. Lieutenant Amos D. Rood of Company K later claimed that he was the officer of the 7th Wisconsin to whom Burns reported. At the time, the regiment was not engaged, there being a lull in the fighting. Rood had had little sleep during the previous 36 hours, and during the lull had fallen asleep, using the trunk of an oak tree as a headrest. Suddenly, an artillery shell cut through the branches above him, and a huge limb came tumbling down and landed on his right kneecap. This brought Rood to his feet in an instant, and as he examined the nature of the shock, he heard a voice. "Got hurt, did ye?" He noticed a citizen standing near him with an old musket, and asked him what he was doing there. He said, "I am an officer of the law, a constable for many years. I live in the last house there," pointing to Gettysburg. "When you boys went at a run out here, I told my woman I was going out to help ye. I asked him his name, and he told me. Said he was 68 years old. He wore a dark blue swallowtail, broadcloth coat and vest, and a sort of Quaker hat, blue cloth pants with an old-fashioned barn door flap across front, and with brass button plain about the size of our present 1 cent. His musket was an old flintlock gun, and he seemed determined to fight." Rood tried to convince Burns to go back to town, but in the end he took him to Lieutenant Colonel John B. Callis, where Rood noted the patriotism and the excellent courage of the veteran won prompt recognition. As with Burns meeting with Colonel Wister of the 150th, there are several similar but slightly different versions of his encounter with Callis. An early account by the colonel himself stated that during the lull, an old man approached us from the rear with a blue swallow-tailed coat, rolling collar, and brass buttons, carrying a long small-bore rifle and an old plug hat on, with tight striped pants. I thought he was a Yank by his dress. He came up to me and said in a feeble but resolute voice, "Sir, are you in command of this regiment?" I answered yes, and he said, "Will you allow me to fight in your regiment?" To which I replied, "Old man, you had better go to the rear or you might get hurt. The rebels are very careless about how they shoot, and you are liable to get killed any moment. See, the bullets are flying pretty thick now." "But, tut," said the old man, "I've heard the whistle of bullets before." "Well then, if you will fight, you must take a gun that will do some good." Handing him a nice silver-mounted rifle that I had captured, he looked at it and said, "That does look better than my squirrel gun. I will try it." He took it and started out in front of our line, which was laying down at the time, and said he, "I want to get a sight at one of them." So that's one of the accounts by good old John Burns, by Colonel John B. Callis and Officer Rude, about him coming in. There's other account where he enlisted, he did everything, and at one point in time they actually finally fought and they got him the pension, and they had to go sift through all the records and everything, but he was inducted that day and he fought. He got wounded as well. He took a couple bits of, we believe it's small arms fire he suffered from, and eventually they patched him up, and when the battle was over, he became a national and even local celebrity, and there's many pictures about him sitting by his house that you can see, and that's how the local legend of John Burns came to be. And actually, this is my first time seeing him, so. Alright, so I'm now in the vicinity, actually, right at General Reynolds' spot where he was killed. There's a marker right here. That's right behind me. That's roughly where he was killed, they said. It says Major General John F. Reynolds, commanding left wing, 1st, 3rd, and 11th Corps, Army of the Potomac, July 1st, 1863. Erected by the state of Pennsylvania, July 1886. Now, we're not so sure if it was a sniper, but a lot of records say it was just a musket ball that killed Reynolds, and it happened here in this vicinity, and the bullet came from that way. Whatever the killing piece of metal came from this, and back then it wouldn't have looked like this. There was a lot of animals that came and they grazed, and this would have been a little bit more open, but a little bit more denser of woods. But it could be understood, or that it could have been a sniper. It could have been a random volley shot that killed him. But the Confederates were coming through this line right here while Reynolds was getting his men to regroup and get them rallied up and going, because in the heat of battle, your nerves, I've never served, but I've heard that your nerves sometimes it gives you a fight or flight kind of thing, like those instincts kicked in, and when those instincts kick in, if you got a cool level head, that's who you want commanding, and you can redirect your men, say, hey, let's go, and come on, we got to fight on, we got to press on. And that's what Reynolds was doing when he was here, and he was able to rally the men up and get them going. But once he got shot and then got killed, it kind of created a shockwave throughout the entire Army of the Potomac. And the Army of Northern Virginia, they were coming this way, and his body would be taken to the center of town and hidden, because they didn't want the Confederates to capture his body and do whatever they pleased with it. So that was the highest casualty of this battle, was Major General John Reynolds. So with his passing, there's going to be some friction, some moving up in the lines, but all in all, his death, as I said, will not go in vain, or will not be in vain. And yeah, we're gonna get to that point coming on. So stick to the next episode, or stay tuned for the next episode. And yeah, that pretty much wraps up day 1 of Gettysburg.